Right, let's turn to this now. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes has meanwhile found that many victims of human trafficking are used to ferry drugs across international borders. The victims are often forced to swallow or ingest balloons containing illicit drugs, which are retrieved from the victim's body at a planned destination. Former Deputy Justice Minister John Jeffery joins us for more on that. Good to have you, Deputy Minister. Former Deputy Minister, Mr. Jeffery, thank you very much for your time. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime saying that there is, of course, a degree of connection between human trafficking and those who are being trafficked, being exploited for forced labor, this time around being that of trafficking drugs. What did you find in your time would have been the working relationship between drug syndicates and those who traffic humans?
Yeah, I don't recall really any cases relating to people humans being trafficked to bring drugs into the country. Drug trafficking generally was something else. But the whole issue with human trafficking, it is possible, is that a person is forced to do something or is given false information. They could be told, look, this is these are not drugs in this suitcase. These are presents for my relatives in the country that you're going to. So that could lead to them being a victim of trafficking. But the key thing with trafficking is that, yeah, they must be forced or they must have pressure put on them to do something they don't want to do. I think the problem with a lot of drug traffickers is that they know what they're doing. They're promised a lot of money, and so they're then willing to take the risk. Yeah. But each case would have to be looked at on a case-by-case level. Yeah,
thoroughly unrelated crimes. I mean, but sometimes, of course, there's a connection. But these are separate crimes. They are specific crimes in terms of how they look at them. But is there a connection, for example, between where these syndicates operate in terms of routes that they use and regions in which they operate?
As far as I'm aware, the drug trafficking is specific routes, specific countries, and people may notice if they fly from that country that there's a greater security at the airport when they get off the plane. People monitoring. I definitely found that the one time I traveled for one of those venues. There's not too much evidence of, well, people are trafficked into South Africa for sex purposes, for labor purposes. So those are the main forms of trafficking that take place. Yeah, but the issue of the same routes, I think they're more different. I haven't seen this UN ODC study, but I'm not, as I said, aware from when I was Deputy Minister that there was much by way of humans being forced to traffic drugs.
Yeah, we seem to be making inroads, especially if you look at what has been happening, at least in the last 4 weeks of September, at least every week, drug mule being arrested at the OR Tambo International Airport. Something certainly being done right as far as that is concerned. But in our previous conversations, of course, we were talking about new legislation. We were also talking about more training for law enforcement officials, particularly in understanding the crime of human trafficking. Are we making inroads in that regard?
As far as I'm aware, we are. Every country in the world gets assessed by the United States State Department in terms of legislation, American legislation. We were unfortunately on the Tier 2 watch list. We got upgraded a few months ago to the off the watch list onto tier 2. I think it's generally accepted that we've got good laws. It's the issue, as always, of implementation. It is issues of training. I mean, the fact that somebody is brought into South Africa does not necessarily mean they're trafficked. To be trafficked, it would mean that they would have to be brought in under false pretenses. They would be promised a lot of money in employment and then find that they're doing something different. They would lose their passports, those kinds of things. So you get people being illegally brought to South Africa, but that's not necessarily human trafficking. It's those elements that I spoke about. But there is greater coordination between the different departments. There is an increase in prosecutions, and generally the sentences given to people found guilty of human trafficking are quite severe.
Yeah. Interesting that you bring that up, because we would have had, for example, 2 instances. One instance would have been an interception by the BMA, Border Management Authority, of a bus that had people clearly being brought into the country, but didn't have documentation. You're saying that might have not been human trafficking more than being a smuggling of people into a country illegally, therefore breaking the Immigration Act more than a crime of human trafficking.
Yes, there were some, when the incident happened, there was some talk of it being that these children were victims of trafficking. It, though, then appeared that they actually were being brought in to stay with their parents who were from Zimbabwe during the school holidays, and that arrangements had been made for them to come. So although it was very much illegal, it wasn't human trafficking because it was voluntary.
And the other instance then where people would have been found in some suburb in a house, I think it was 40 of them that the police would have discovered staying in this particular house, saying, well, we don't really know how we got here. We were brought here by whoever the leader of that syndicate would have been. Would that then constitute a human trafficking incident?
That sounds more like trafficking, where you're forced to do something. It doesn't necessarily have to be that you're locked into a house. You could be forced to be there, not feel that you can move out because of threats to you or to your family, or that you just simply can't speak the language or any of the languages of South Africa, and you don't have your passport, and you've been told you'll be arrested and thrown into jail if you go to the police. So what I'm trying to say is you don't have to be locked up to be a victim of trafficking. They can find other ways of forcing you. But that particular case sounds more like trafficking, and some of the normal traits of trafficking, where people are brought in under false pretenses and then found that they are actually working, but they're working for a lot less than they expected, and they've had their passports taken away, and often they can't do anything. Another aspect of trafficking would be debt bondage, which doesn't have to be from people from other countries, can happen to a South African here as well, where somebody claims that you owe them money. Maybe they paid for your transport to Johannesburg to look for work, and then they start saying you owe them this huge amount of money, and you're going to have to get involved in selling sex to pay them back. So debt bondage can also be a feature of human trafficking.
Debt bondage, and I always think as we look at some of these young people who are caught as drug mules, quite young, I mean, could that also be a strategy that gets someone that young to want to participate in trafficking drugs in such a manner?
I would suspect it's more likely to be that they're offered large amounts of money and they think it's worth the risk. That would be my own view, but it could be because, the debt bondage usually arises when you've already been given something that you've now got to pay back. So I guess they could, I suppose where it would work with drug trafficking would be that somebody gets flown to South Africa, they're not carrying any drugs, and then they get told, if you want to go home, you owe us these large amounts of money, but don't worry. As long as you take these drugs, it'll all be settled. So that would be some form of debt bondage.
Yeah. These are mafia-style kind of organized crime, drug trafficking, human trafficking. We're also dealing with extortion, but I don't want to extend it there. But what makes these particular crimes? Because when I read this particular report by the United Nations, it says they are complex crime to prosecute.
Yeah, well, there's very many actors. You can have a victim of human trafficking who also becomes a perpetrator, gets sucked in and starts facilitating the trafficking of other people. They don't necessarily have to be syndicates. I mean, a simple issue of a family from a rural area send a young woman to the city to work for, it could even be a relative. And that person, that young woman doesn't really have any choice as to whether she's going or not. She doesn't get paid much by way of money. The money gets sent to the parents back home. That could be human trafficking, and that's then not involving a syndicate at all. Yeah. So it varies. Obviously, the more complex cases of smuggling large amounts of people, large numbers of people across borders would be more of trafficking if they're being forced to come here or promise things that actually they're not going to be getting. Those could be trafficking, or you can have internal trafficking where you've got caught up, as I said, largely often through debt bondage, and you've got to pay off this debt and therefore work it for very little money.
Yeah. According to the INACT Global Organized Crime Index, South Africa as a country has not measured up to expectations in terms of dealing with organized crime. Almost to say, if we can be able to up our game as far as being able to deal with organized crime, it will almost be like a silver bullet that would be able to address all these issues, because we've got the right legislation in place, we've got the right legal framework in place, but our struggle is really in how we deal with organized crime. Would you agree with that sentiment?
Yeah, I think that we need, well, let me put it this way, we need to do a lot more in combating organized crime. And we need to ensure that when we're dealing with organized crime, that we're dealing with the leaders. It's no use, let's say, when it comes to the selling of drugs, that you target the runners, the people who are actually doing the selling, because they can be arrested, and the people actually organizing the whole thing will just find other people to replace them very quickly. We need to be focusing on the leadership of these syndicates, and ensure that they are prosecuted and that they're found guilty and get given heavy sentences, and that would also be a deterrent.